for many reporters, we heard this was one of several virtual pressers today for you. So just to clarify, you are coming to the virtual press conference on the Texas redistricting lawsuit, Fair Maps Texas Action Committee versus Abbott. We'll get started in just a few seconds. And as folks come in, the media and other guests, if you would put your name in the chat, as well as which media outlet or organization you're representing today, that would be so helpful. Let us know who we're talking to today. And we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's virtual press conference on the Texas redistricting lawsuit, Fair Maps Texas Action Committee versus Abbott. My name is Sailor Jones. I'm Communications Director with Southern Coalition for Social Justice, or SCSJ, if that's a mouthful. My colleague, Gino Nuzalillo, will be helping to take your questions, and we'll be here today with media contacts Selena Escalera and Stuart Sia, who you may know and who you may also be reached out to by. To the media in attendance today, because I know we have some organizational partners here, if possible, could you do two things for us? First, rename yourself or type your name and your media outlet in the chat so we know who is here. Second, we'll be taking your questions today during the press conference. I know that's why you're here, so feel free to place your questions in the chat anytime or raise your hand using that handy dandy hand raise function when the time is right, and we'll make sure you can ask your question yourself. One last thing, since we're a big crowd today, as big as Texas, it seems like, with the participants, when coming off mute, please let us know who you are and your media outlet so today's speakers can know who they're addressing. If you need to reach out to us for follow-up questions, we'll drop it in the chat, but you can reach us at media@scsj.org. We'll also provide a recording of this presser and all other information that you need, including names, spellings, bios, contacts for the speakers, and we'll drop that short link, scsj.org/fairmapstexasmedia, into the chat as well. We'll also be providing the recording in that folder, and so we'll email you when that's ready after the press conference. So now, without further ado, yesterday, November 16th, 2021, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, the ACLU of Texas, and the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Texas, the Austin Division, against Texas Governor Greg Abbott on behalf of the Fair Maps Texas Action Committee, which we'll talk more about in a second, the Organization of Chinese Americans, or OCA, Greater Houston, the North Texas chapter of the Asian Pacific Islander Americans Public Affairs Association, Engage Texas, and 13 individual plaintiffs, some of whom are here tonight. It is worth mentioning that organizational plaintiff, Fair Maps Texas Action Committee, that I mentioned earlier, includes the ACLU of Texas, Clean Elections Texas, League of Women Voters of Texas, Our Vote Texas, National Council of Jewish Women, Greater Dallas Section, Texans Against Gerrymandering, and Common Cause Texas. Today, from this very distinguished and long list, we have with us Noor Taj, Voting Rights Counsel with the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, Jerry Vadamala, Director of the Democracy Program at the Asian American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, Susanna Lorenzo Giguere, Senior Staff Attorney, Asian American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, David Donati, Staff Attorney, ACLU of Texas, Stephanie Swanson, who's running a dual role tonight. She's an organizational plaintiff and chair for Fair Maps Texas Action Committee and a member of the League of Women Voters of Texas. Lydia Azuna, President, Texans Against Gerrymandering. Amatullah Contractor, individual plaintiff and Harris County resident. And Deborah Chen, individual plaintiff and Harris County resident. This suit, Fair Maps Texas Action Committee versus Abbott, details an inadequate redistricting process lacking transparency, which led to discriminatory voting maps that dilute the political power of communities of color, namely Black, Latino, and Asian American and Pacific Islander voters. To shed more light on this case, I'll turn it over to our attorneys, starting with Noor Taj with SCSJ. Noor.
Thank you, Sailor. Yesterday, we brought suit on behalf of a very diverse group of organizational and individual plaintiffs, challenging the unlawful state house, state senate, and congressional maps that were recently passed in Texas because they constitute racial gerrymanders and are intentionally discriminatory against Latino, Black, and Asian American Pacific Islander, or API, communities. The maps also fail to draw coalition districts that were mandated by Section 2 of the VRA in several regions, including in and around Fort Bend, Harris, Bell, Tarrant, and Collin counties. As many of you all know, people of color accounted for 95% of the population increase in Texas. This makes Texas one of the most diverse states in this country. But you would not know that by looking at the maps, which purposely crack communities of color throughout the state. In drawing these maps, the Texas legislature employed the same unlawful tactics that the federal courts have consistently shot down in past redistricting cycles, including the last one. The rushed process by which these maps were drawn and passed reflect discriminatory intent. People were not given notice to examine the proposed maps and comment. Legislators used voting age population instead of the more appropriate citizen voting age population metrics. Legislators ignored testimony demonstrating that the proposed maps were discriminatory. Amendments that would have fixed those issues were rejected. Even amendments that simply asked for analysis of racial impact were rejected, because legislators knew exactly what that analysis would show. These maps are racially discriminatory and gerrymandered. And for some of the areas, all you need to do is actually look at the map to see the racial impact. Our complaint has illustrations that show how the map surgically cut into communities of color. For example, like in Fort Bend County, where the population has grown to more than 22% API, the House map cracks the population into 3 or 4 districts to dilute them. Legislators know that voting is racially polarized throughout Texas. And in many of these areas, voters of color vote cohesively to elect their candidate of choice. The House map also cracked the growing AAPI community in Collin County into 6 different districts. Without such cracking, there would also be a coalition district there. The pattern is repeated over and over again in the state Senate and the congressional maps as well. The API community in Fort Bend, once again, cracked into 3 different districts in the Senate map. In Tarrant, Senate districts 10 and 22 crack communities of color. Same with the congressional maps. In Harris, Fort Bend region, the API community is yet again cracked into 3 different districts. And in Collin County, the racial gerrymander appears quite blatant, cracking the API community, taking them away from Congressional District 3, where they were before in the benchmark maps, into Congressional District 4, which is combined with 12 other majority white counties. That is why we believe all 3 maps are unconstitutional and violate Section 2 of the VRA. Our lawsuit is complementary and consistent with those that have already been filed over the last couple of weeks. But our diverse plaintiff group and our claims bring a unique perspective because we're not only highlighting coalition districts, but we're also uplifting the role of the API community in these coalitions. As our chief counsel at SCSJ, Allison Riggs, always says, we do not believe that communities of color should fight for the scraps from the table of white supremacy. All historically disenfranchised communities need a seat at the table. And ultimately, that is what our lawsuit is about. And with that, I'd like to open it up to my colleagues to add some more information.
Thanks, Noor. Just to reiterate some of the demographics that Noor mentioned, there's been a 95% growth, population growth throughout Texas of people of color, and the very fastest growth was among Asian Pacific Americans. It's important to see that that growth is compared to white population growth by a factor of 4 to 1. in some of the places that Noor mentioned, like Fort Bend, where the population has increased by as much as 84%, the population is 22% Asian American now. And it's increased over 2/3 in the last decade to 1.5 million. In some place like Austin, 1 out of every 5 new residents in the last decade is Asian American. And the population of Asians has practically doubled. These are just numbers, but what they mean are people. It means that that community is growing, and that community is an important one that needs to have its voice heard. And we're hoping that with the complaint that we filed last night, we will get a measure of some of that ability to let the Asian Pacific Americans in Texas elect their candidate of choice. Jerry?
Hi, thank you, Susanna. Yeah, this lawsuit is about fairness. It's about democracy. And if you look at our plaintiffs, you see individuals, you see organizations that are doing really great work all across Texas. The Asian community, as my colleague Susanna mentioned, has grown tremendously. It's the fastest growing racial group in the country, and as well as in Texas. And in many of the counties that we're talking about, it's the fastest growing racial group. And what these maps do, they turn those census numbers on its head, okay? And it blunts that growth. And so many groups in Fort Bend, in Collin County, in Tarrant County, in Harris County have worked so hard for so long to build these communities, to have a voice. And these lines are essentially silencing them. And as Nora mentioned, surgically removing these communities and adding them with white rural counties all across the state, and especially the place that we highlighted. If you look at our complaint, you see those places where we put a heat map, a racial heat map of the Asian population, and you see these lines that go directly through the most concentrated parts, take a small piece, and then put them with white population to essentially dilute their vote. We are seeking in this complaint to have an equal voice. That's what all these lawsuits are seeking, is to have an equal opportunity to elect a candidate of our choice. And we're hoping the court will agree with us and remedy these really egregious lines. It's very hard to come to any other conclusion than this was intentional racial discrimination. It's very hard to come to any other conclusion. For that, I'll pass it on to David.
Much, Jerry, and thank you all for having me. David Donati, I'm a staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union of Texas. I grew up in Fort Bend County, one of the areas we're suing about, and I live in Texas. And as a result, I've seen the state's tremendous growth, as well as its tremendous diversity firsthand. And I know the way that we, as communities of color, organize together and vote together to demand representation that is responsive to our shared interests. But just as long as I've seen our diversity, I've seen the state of Texas's machinations to deny communities of color their rightful democratic representation. And so in every decade since the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, a federal court has intervened to deny Texas's unlawful racial gerrymandering. The state has used some new tools now, some old tools, but the discriminatory design is precisely the same. And we are so proud to stand with the groups here, with the Texas Fair Maps Action Committee and a diverse coalition of organizations and voters to demand equitable electoral districts.
Thank you, David, and to all the attorneys. And don't worry, to everyone here, Jerry is not driving while providing this press conference. No one was injured in the making of this particular press conference. But before we open it up to your questions from the media, we really want to shed light on some of the most important pieces of this lawsuit, and that is the organizational and individual plaintiffs, providing them an opportunity to speak on why they joined this lawsuit, why they are leading this lawsuit, and how it impacts them as Texans. Stephanie, Lydia, Amatullah, and Deborah, I want to open it up to you at this point, and maybe I can start with Lydia, who I know had a few words to say about why you are a part of this lawsuit in Texas.
Thank you, Sailor. What I want to emphasize this afternoon for everyone is the fury and frustration that is felt by all of our communities of color in the state of Texas, with our neighborhoods once again chopped and diced without regard for our state's growth and diversity. And unlike the original Ronco Vegematic from the 1960s and 70s, these cuts were done with precision, with the purpose of crushing the hopes and dreams of people of color in Texas. I come from a long line of Latino people. My people were here when everybody else came here. And throughout this history of Texas, our communities have suffered from lack of representation. All we're asking, give us a chance. Give us a chance to have the representatives in our state mirror our communities.
I'll hop in next. I'm Stephanie Swanson. I'm here representing both the League of Women Voters of Texas and the Fair Maps Texas Action Committee. I have a prepared statement that I put together really quickly before the call, so I'm just going to read through it so folks are familiar with Fair Maps Texas Coalition and our work over the past 4 years. So it was a little over 4 years ago now that the Fair Maps Texas Coalition was formed with the mission of improving the redistricting process in Texas. Over the years, we have worked to expand our coalition and mobilize communities across the state, and we've worked to ensure that folks from diverse communities have a seat at the table. Much of our work is focused on mobilizing the public to engage in the redistricting process. Given Texas's long track record of discriminating against voters of color in their election maps, we knew that this next redistricting cycle would be extremely challenging, given that the state would be redistricting without the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act being in place. Because of this, much of our work focused on creating a more transparent process. Sunlight disinfects. If the line drawers aren't doing anything funny, then there's no reason to go behind closed doors. We understood that the public needed to see and understand who was drawing the maps and how they were being drawn, so that they can engage in the process and advocate on behalf of their communities. Despite our best attempts, though, Texas decided to draw their maps using a flawed process. Texas's redistricting hearings offered little transparency and opportunity for meaningful public input. Discussions were either not held or rushed, and testimony was cut short and ignored. Even several serious warnings of racially discriminatory intention and effect were set aside and discarded. Given what we saw going on and given the resulting maps that the legislature produced, we knew that we could not sit back and let this happen, and that's why we chose to take action. We gathered up our partners from across the state, and here we are today. So we are happy to join our partners from across the state in fighting against racial gerrymandering by the Texas legislators. The current maps are clearly discriminatory and violate the Voting Rights Act. All communities, no matter their race, deserve fair representation.
Thank you, Stephanie. And Stephanie and Lydia both representing organizational plaintiffs as part of this lawsuit. Amatullah and Deborah, I wanted to open it up for you, your option if you have any remarks before we open it up to the media.
Thank you. I wanted to reiterate something that Susanna mentioned, that, you know, we're listing a lot of numbers right now, but behind these numbers are real people, and these maps have real consequences on real people. Our vote is being diluted, and as a member of the Asian community, I mean, our voices and our representation is being retrogressed. As one of the fastest growing ethnic minorities, I had an expectation for more representation from our legislators with these maps. However, despite our attempts to try and testify and ask that for a fair and transparent process, our requests were denied. This process was very rushed and did not actually involve community input, and community input wasn't really taken into consideration in these maps, which really prove that our voice was being diluted throughout the process. And that's exactly reflected in these maps as well, that Asian community power and just power for the communities of color has been very intentionally and surgically diluted to keep us from just having equal representation.
I want to echo what Amatullah said. This is the third round of census and redistricting that I've done as a volunteer and as a community member, and even with a community organization in the AAPI community that cares about representation for our people. And it's extremely disheartening. This process was non-transparent from the beginning. There was not realistic timelines given for communities to have an opportunity to say anything. The fact that we're in the middle of COVID and to say that you're not going to have virtual hearings made available, forcing people to literally come from across the state to show up in Austin. I literally sat in one hearing room where there were people there from El Paso who had flown in, and we had to wait the entire day. They did not follow a schedule of like who signed up when. You just had to sit there, and it was purely at the discretion of the chair to choose who was going to have the opportunity to speak for their 1 minute of time, right? That's an egregious example of how untransparent and literally just kind of going through the motions, as our rights were literally being taken away from our communities to have the option to have real voices and someone who is going to represent the interests of our community. And as somebody who has literally been volunteering doing this type of work for the past almost 30 some years, each census we go to community members and say, hey, you need to fill this out to make sure that our voices are heard, we get counted. This is, taxpayer money is what it comes down to. It's not even just about power, right? The census decides, all the taxpayer money, how does that get allocated? And then the redistricting decides who gets to make those decisions, the policy decisions of how our taxpayer funds are allocated and spent. Are they actually being invested in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our hospitals? Who is going to know better than the people who live there? We should have the opportunity to choose people who are going to represent us well. And this process did not do that.
Thank you so much, Deborah and Amatullah, for representing individual plaintiffs who have been harmed by these maps in the great state of Texas. We really appreciate you speaking today. And at this point, we'd like to turn it over to the media and for your questions. As a reminder, please drop your questions into the chat or raise your hand using the raise hand function in the lower right-hand corner. I do see a few questions in the chat to start. Timothy Dowling asks, how many suits have been filed in Texas so far? And are there any thoughts about consolidating the lawsuits that exist? And I'll turn that over to the attorney.
Happy to answer. So yes, there's been, I believe, 5 lawsuits, if I'm counting correctly, that have been filed already. There is a motion to consolidate already pending in one of these cases. And so more likely than not, these cases all will be consolidated, but we are waiting to see what happens with that pending motion.
Thank you, Noor. And another question from Sandy Close. Did the legislature seek to divide and rule, pitting one ethnic and racial group against others? Or did it just want to diminish the influence of all communities of color?
Happy to take it. So sure, I can start and then hand it over to you, Jerry. I think one of the tactics to diminish all the voting power of all communities of color is to pit them against one another. So I don't know if that's an either or answer to that question, but I think one of those tactics is to create this narrative that there are only a select few districts that can be handed out to minority groups and to pit them against one another. And I think, that's a false narrative. That's not what the law provides for. And I think that really is why we're bringing these claims and really focusing on coalition districts, because that also kind of opposes that false narrative that there can only be a select few. But Jerry, I knew that you wanted to say something.
Well, no, I just want to agree to what Nora was saying, but also say, when you look at the other lawsuits, yeah, no, I think all communities of colors were negatively affected by these lines. So it's not only us, all the communities of color protected under the Voting Rights Act, with substantial numbers in Texas, were adversely affected by these maps. And that's why you see the lawsuits from different groups.
Thank you, Jerry and Nor. And I want to turn it over. Gino, are you seeing any other questions from the raised hand function or in the chat?
Not currently, Sailor, but if there are members of the media who would like to ask a question at this time, please do use the raise hand function. I will take you off of mute and allow you to ask your question at that time. So please feel free to do so now.
And while we wait, we know it's late, and our plaintiffs and our attorneys were very comprehensive, sharing not only the stories of people who would be impacted by these maps, but the legal consequences as well. And while we're waiting for questions, what we were going to close with was really a timeline or any concluding thoughts on that. Oh, I think we do have a question.
Yeah, there was a question about AAPI. Is that the one you were going to?
Sandy Close asks, how inclusive is the term AAPI?
Yeah, no, so, you have your census categories, and you can see from our plaintiffs also, we have under that category, East Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian, also Pacific Islander. So it is really mirrors the census categories, and is very broad.
Thank you, Jerry. And Mark from Ethnic Media Services asks, why was this particular court chosen for the filing of the suit?
I can take a shot at that as well. So I think that there were a few different considerations at play. As we mentioned, there are 5 redistricting cases that have been filed, all of which have been assigned to 3-judge panels. And so we are anticipating that kind of consolidation and trying to work well with our partner organizations that are likewise filing suit. And then there are just certain things that we lawyers think about. For example, we're suing Governor Greg Abbott and Secretary of State Scott, both of whom reside in Austin. And so there's no question that it's a proper court to bring this case. Ultimately, it seems likely that this case will either be in Austin or in El Paso, but in any event in the Western District of Texas.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that. And Gino, are there any additional questions by raised hand?
I see no others, Sailor, and so this may be a good time to move the closing comment. Just as a reminder to all members of the media, we have all of these materials ready and available for you at the short link that we put in the chat. We will also have a recording of this press conference available within a half hour of our closing today. And it looks like we have a follow-up question from Mark Sailor, if you'd like to share that.
Yeah, Mark asked, does the Western District have a record on such cases, David, or any of the other attorneys?
It may be difficult just to search on the court's electronic databases for redistricting cases. One thing that I might point you to is when we filed our case, we filed a notice of related cases, which give you an indication of the cases that we think are related. And I can make sure that the communication staff here has that list of cases, so you'll be able to see it. Unfortunately, at this time, unless and until they're consolidated, you may have to dig through to look at them individually.
Thank you, David, and thanks, Mark, for your questions. This may be a good time to segue into those closing remarks, but also any thoughts on a timeline for this case and what's next for Fair Maps Texas v. Abbott.
I can go ahead with that. So I think, I mean, obviously, and this is what we just talked about, the very next step is to know what court we're ultimately going to be in and how the consolidation plays out. And I think that's the primary thing that we are focusing on at this time. But as a closing remark, I really want to say thank you to our plaintiffs. It is, our organizational plaintiffs have been working tirelessly for years for this redistricting process, but also our individual named plaintiffs. It's a very courageous thing to step up and to put your name on this kind of lawsuit and to fight for what's right. And it's our honor and privilege to represent you. And I really want to uplift you all and shout you out for being courageous and for stepping up to do the right thing. I'll pass it on to my colleagues.
Yeah, if I could just echo on that, I know both Debbie and Amatullah and a whole bunch of other folks that we worked together to testify, or at least attempt to testify about the injustice of these lines and the sense of despair that so many of us had when we saw that the decision was made to, vote on the lines right after the hearing ended, making it clear that there was no intention of listening to anything that was said or anything that was submitted. So, the fight continues, and we couldn't do this work without our clients and our partners. There's a lot of partners also that weren't able to take part in this lawsuit, but are cheering us on. And for anyone that was watching those redistricting hearings, you saw how many people from the community came out to testify, to say how unfair these lines were. This lawsuit is about all of them and all of us, and the community that is being so badly treated here. And, we can't let that stand. So I just want to, again, echo that. Thank you to the clients, the plaintiffs here, as well as all the other folks that came out to testify. We're going to keep fighting for everybody there. Anybody else? I don't know if Susanna or David, did you want to add to that, or we kick it back to Sailor?
I'm happy to kick it back, but I completely echo Jerry and Noor's comments, and we're very grateful to be fighting with All Deaf and the Southern Coalition of Social Justice as well, in addition to our spectacular organizational and individual plaintiffs.
I'm just echoing what they said.
Thank you, friends. And I want to just ask if there are any closing remarks from Susanna or any of the individual or organizational plaintiffs as well.
I would just reiterate what Jerry, Noor, and David said. Grateful to be working with our wonderful partners, community partners. They are partners not just in things like redistricting, but down to the very nitty-gritty of get out the vote and working with people, working with voters at the very grassroots level. All of you really are doing this for the community, and we really appreciate it. And we appreciate being partners with you at that end, and also with SCSJ and ACLU. Thank you.
I would just like to say thank you on behalf of myself and my organization that I volunteer, work with. Y'all's support over the years helps to make this a bit more bearable.
Yeah, echoing the same sentiments. Like, thank you for standing alongside us and our communities in the fight for fair representation. Thank you.
We know this is a long road. We have a long journey ahead of us, but I, for one, am very proud and honored to be here with all of you on the call. And I look forward every day to working with you, and you make everything a lot better and more tolerable, but I just want to say thank you.
Thank you, friends. And want to give out appreciations to Noor, Jerry, Susanna, David, Stephanie, Lydia, Amatullah, and Debbie. I'm grateful for your time tonight and for all the media and organizational partners who came this evening. Again, if you've got more questions, burning questions that you forgot now but need them later, you can reach us at media@scsj.org. And as Gino put in the chat, a short link to all the materials, including spellings of everyone's names, headshots, and more information, including legal documents, is available now at scsj.org/FairmaxTexasMedia. With that, we'll send you an email of the recording within a half hour. Everybody who registered and attended will get one. Friends, thank you for being with us tonight, and we look forward to developments with the case moving forward. And we'll update this group and everyone else as soon as we know more. Thanks again, friends, and have a great evening. Good night, everyone.